Look, our conference theme, Not Ashamed, for many of us who've grown up in church like I have, it will take our minds straight back to the biblical book of Romans when Paul writes, let me get this up here. When Paul writes that he is not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. So when we see not ashamed, that's where our minds often go to. Paul used that language of not being ashamed because he knew that people did take offence at the message of the gospel, and that people taking offence has a way of shutting the gospel down, shutting us up. Paul himself had been put in jail because of it, but here in this passage he was making it clear that whether or not it caused offence, he would not be ashamed, and he would not be shamed into remaining silent. Because this gospel is the only message that has the power to change lives. It's the only message that has the power to bring freedom, fulfilment and peace. And he shared that truth of the gospel in the same way as we should share the truth of the gospel, because he loved God and he loved others. That's why he shared it. And when we talk about the gospel in the context of the church, we typically talk about personal transformation and of our need as individuals to come to a personal belief in the fullness of who Jesus is, and an acknowledgement of our need to repent and surrender our lives to him. And this is good because the gospel is about transformation. But the gospel is not only about personal transformation. The redemptive power of the gospel is also about transforming communities. It is to be worked out in our everyday lives, in the presence of other people, and this is because we want them too to find the truth. The gospel is about Jesus. Jesus is the truth. And it is only the truth that will actually set people free. So we are not to be ashamed of the gospel. We are not to be ashamed of truth. And, that's relatively easy today here amongst you all. And it's relatively easy tomorrow morning as I go to church with my husband. It's relatively easy within the walls of our safety of our church. But it's when we stand with God in the workplace or the school, or for some it's in our families, that's when it can be difficult. And standing with God, advancing his kingdom here on earth, that's not a static position for Christians. It's not simply wearing a cross. Wearing a cross is often quite a fashion statement, and it doesn't mean anything for many people. So wearing a cross is not what indicates that we are a Christian. Lots of other people who follow other religions, they can be easily recognised by their clothing, but not so for Christians. We are to be recognised by our lives and our speech. And this balance with our lives and speech is really important. And so before I start talking about gender fluid ideology, I just wanted to say this about our lives and our speech and how it needs to match up. We've already talked about the Apostle Paul, and he was not ashamed to speak the truth, but he also understood the delicate balance that exists between truth and grace. He said this, "Let your conversation be always with grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." So we who have been shown so much grace, we should be the most gracious of all people. Our culture tries to intimidate us with accusations that we are haters, that we are backward or narrow-minded, and how we react to these charges, I would say, is an indication of our own spiritual maturity and our understanding of grace. Our attitude when we are accused of being hateful is to be that of Christ's. And when Paul wrote to the Philippians, he said this, "Don't act out of selfish ambition or be conceited. Instead, humbly think of others as being better than yourselves. Have the same attitude that Jesus had. Even though he was equal with God, he didn't take advantage of that, but rather he took on the form of a servant. He humbled himself." So the opposite, I would say, of ashamed of the gospel is not proud to be a Christian. The opposite of ashamed of the gospel is passionate to share God's truth. But it's one of those catch-22 sort of situations, because truth by definition is exclusive. And that is why truth causes offence. And today, to cause offence is quite literally a criminal action. But people's very lives depend on being told the truth. You can think of many cases where this is so. People's lives depend on being told the truth. So it's not loving to keep the truth to ourselves. If we want to be heard, though, we must speak that truth in love. It's urgent that we do that. And so I want to speak truth today on an extremely important issue, and I hope that in doing so, I will help to clarify your thoughts, but I also guess what I want to do is give you information to share with others as you make opportunities yourselves to speak the truth and to speak that truth in love. And the issue I want to address is that of gender fluidity, and it is of great concern. You heard that I was a grandmother. I've got 10 grandchildren, and it is of great concern to me for them, but I do feel as if God has put a burden on my heart to be a grandmother for the nation, and I feel concerned for all of our children. Because it's only recently, and really only in regards to human beings, that the concept of male and female has become controversial. The idea that gender is fluid and something you can choose is really part of a newly established orthodoxy. And to contradict that new orthodoxy is actually considered to be a form of heresy. In what is a new experiment, this orthodoxy abides by a set of rules that are governed by an intolerant form of tolerance. There are guinea pigs in this experiment, and the guinea pigs are our children, and the laboratories are our universities and our schools and even our kindergartens. Our children are being targeted by preachers of post-truth doctrine, and we must do everything we can to take back this ground. We cannot be silent. It is not surprising to me that it is our children who are most affected with this gender fluid ideology. It's ideology or it's idiocy, whatever you think is the best term. In Proverbs 22 verse 6, you'll all know this verse. It says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." This is a proverb. It's not a promise, but it's a proverb, and it's a truth nonetheless. But if you go then to other people saying very similar things, we've got St. Francis Xavier in the 1500s. He said, "Give me the child until he is 7, and I'll give you the man." Lenin said this, "Give me 4 years to teach the children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted." Hitler said, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future." And Joseph Stalin said, "Education is a weapon." And so our children are in laboratories that they are being experimented on, and they are too young to be experimented on in this way without any effect. Evidence that our children are being confused by early, and I would say constant, exposure to transgenderism is not hard to find. Referrals of Australian children to gender identity clinics have skyrocketed in the past 5 years, and we have experts all around the country and indeed all around the globe warning that the huge spike is in part due to the promotion of transgender issues in educational facilities, which are actually actively encouraging our children to question their identity. Children are being forced to unlearn the difference between boy and girl. And children too young to know even what a puberty blocker is are being directed by adults into renouncing their natal sex. Educators are normalising the use of hormonal treatments to solve complex issues that relate to mental health and identity. So it was back in 2010 that Australian schools first introduced the Safe Schools program, and this was supposedly to be an anti-bullying program. But after reading its contents and finding very little, if any, anti-bullying in there, or mention of anti-bullying, but rather there was a very heavy focus on the ideology of gender theory, parents across our nation became rightfully outraged. And the outrage is still there. It's still simmering. And if you talk to parents, it's still there. But parents are being silenced. And it's not surprising. It would be hard to understand if you didn't realise that there is a very real risk of parents losing access to their children if they don't support their wish to transition gender. This is a terrifying prospect for any parent. If it's hard for you to believe that, this is from the Victorian Education Department Safe Schools material. I've copied the website that it comes from, so it's freely accessible. And it says, there may be circumstances in which students wish or need to undertake gender transition without the consent of their parents or carers and/or without consulting medical practitioners. So it leaves the decision in the hands of your school as to whether or not your child is mature enough to make that decision for themselves. And parents are then forced to not only accept but to celebrate their child going through transition. And this is despite the fact that without medical intervention, around 90% of children who are in any way confused about their gender will actually embrace their natal sex through puberty. But of course, that's a process which is actually prevented by puberty blockers. Children who are confused about their gender need our respect, our love, and our understanding. And above all, they need the truth. Psychologists that I've spoken to about this issue compare it to an issue of an eating disorder. So if you have a child who is suffering from anorexia, or anyone who is suffering from anorexia, there are a couple of things you don't do. You don't agree with the person that they do have an unusually large face, or that, yes, they are a little bit overweight. You don't agree with them when they're skeletal. But neither do you just stick a cream bun in front of their face and say, eat this and shut up. We walk with that person. I've got good friends who walk with their children through an agonising period of time where they are confused about how they appear. So in the same way as an understanding of anorexia, the person truly believes that they are overweight or in some way deficient in how they look, and they starve themselves because of it. In the same way as talking to them truthfully, lovingly, that's how we should be dealing with children who are confused about their gender. The most thorough follow-up of sex reassigned people is actually a research program that was conducted in Sweden, and it was conducted over 30 years. Now keep in mind that the culture in Sweden is strongly supportive of transgenderism. Sadly, the research documents the lifelong mental unrest of those who have followed through with sex reassignment. When that initial thrill of changing sex dies down, it has been shown over and over again that it is devastating to have to go through life living a counterfeit life. And 10 to 15 years after surgical reassignment, the suicide rate of those who have undergone sex reassignment surgery increases to 20 times that of comparable peers. Now, this is tragic, and it should make our educators, our politicians, our medical practitioners put a stop to the indoctrination that is actually happening in our schools. And it is indoctrination, but the opposite is happening. Despite psychologists warning that children who are confused about their gender do not need puberty blockers or amputation of healthy body parts, gender ideology continues to be taught and encouraged in our schools. So we had the Safe Schools program come in 2010. By 2015, we had the Australian schools introducing the gender fairy. This was written for 4-year-old children. At the time, 2 of our grandchildren were 4 years old, and so it was very personal to me. And in this Gender Fairy book, boys and girls are told only you know if you're a boy or girl, and this is for 4-year-old children. They don't read at that stage, they are read to. And so the images in a book for children this age are very important. And so if you go to the image of the little girl, she's biologically born girl, but she's angry because she wants to be a boy, and the picture shows her wanting to play soccer. Now the stereotype in this is actually really annoying, if that's the kindest word I could say. If a little girl wants to play soccer, it does not mean she's born in the wrong body. She just wants to go out and play soccer. And even perhaps sadder is a little boy, biological born boy, hiding under his bed crying because he wants to dance. And this is read and shown to 4-year-old children. Now, if there's a little boy who's just played in the dress-up box that morning and put on a tutu playing some sort of game, how confusing is that for him to think that perhaps he's born in the wrong body? The very stereotypical pink tutu is really frustrating as well, because I'm seeing a lot of women here today and none of you are wearing a pink tutu. So it's actually a little bit disappointing. So last year, the Genderbread Person program was rolled out. And this is a high school program. It was rolled out in the high school in my electorate. And it teaches students that everybody's gender is fluid. So fluid, in fact, that we all exist on a spectrum that can change many times a day. Now, it teaches children in high school, so it was grade 9, but it teaches them that we swing during the day from male to female or anywhere in between. Again, this is straight from their website. Please feel free to Google the Genderbread Person. The material uses stereotypes that are breathtakingly offensive. In his effort to prove that gender is flexible, the author gives an example of how this theory of his that we are teaching to our children plays out in a normal day. So he describes male traits as eating like a Viking. Okay, some of you have seen my husband eat, and it could be true. But he describes female traits, and this is really worrying. He describes female traits as prowling, skipping, playfully placing items of clothing out to wear, and pleading with your partner to help you decide what it is you should wear that day. So, in his mind, when we're acting in a ditzy way, we're acting with a female brain, and when we're acting strong and decisive and eating like a Viking, that's more of our male brain. But he would not see that as discriminatory because he believes that all of us have those aspects in our lives. But this is what's being taught to girls in grade 9 at school. Ashton Scholastic have recently promoted this Kids Guide to Gender Identity is what it says, and it promotes this idea and it says, babies can't talk, so grown-ups make a guess by looking at their bodies. Ashton Scholastic. So what I'm saying to you today is that transgenderism is primarily a socio-cultural and political phenomenon. It is fueled by both social contagion and groupthink social processes. But the promotion of this is changing the face of a generation. Gender fluid ideology is invading our universities, our schools, and even our kindergartens, and a new normal that is a lie is being blindly accepted. At the core of gender fluid ideology is the claim that feelings determine reality. And from this idea, there has come extreme demands for society to play along with subjective reality claims that actually ignore any contrary evidence. So in November 2018, Australian Labor Senator Louise Pratt stated this. She said, "Drag queen story time is a wonderful idea that celebrates diversity, and I know," she says, "that children and families will really enjoy this family-friendly celebration of LGBTI culture." I need to tell you that Senator Pratt is currently the chair of the Senate Standing Committee which oversees education. The Andrews government in Victoria has reintroduced a bill recently that will allow people to choose their birth certificates as male, the gender on their birth certificates as male, female or non-binary options, and there is no requirement for surgery. So this view of sex actually comes from a belief that sex and gender are socially constructed, and we've heard so much about that. Elizabeth, your talk was just amazing. Thank you so much for investing the time that sort of research takes. We appreciate it. But it means that we create our identity through our words and our actions. It is ridiculous that this marginal theory is being written into Australian law. And it's equally ridiculous that anyone who questions it is automatically branded as transphobic. The implications of gender fluid ideology in sport are absolutely astounding. Virtually all elite sports are segregated into male and female competitions. These are the things we need to say to people when they talk to us, because people are confused about this. Their children are coming home with ideas that they've never heard of before, and they are confused. The reason why we segregate male and female competitions is to allow female athletes a chance to win and be the best in their field, because males on average have longer limbs, they're a larger rib cage, they've got larger organs such as heart and lungs, bigger hands, their legs are more vertical due to a narrow pelvis, the list goes on and on. The male body is actually optimised for physical performance. The female body is built to be able to bear children. So it's built differently. It's not that every female will have children, but that is how our bodies are built. But ignoring this, the International Olympic Committee has relaxed the eligibility criteria to compete in female sport to enable male-born transgender people to compete. So they've done two main things. They've done a lot of things, but two of them, the main ones, are they've removed the requirement for genital reassignment surgery to compete as a woman, and they've also increased the level of testosterone that is allowed for competitors in the female competition. So it used to be, when we found that there were drug cheats, it was because there was an increased level of testosterone in the women and they were winning competitions because of that. Now we've had to raise that level of testosterone that's allowed so that we can allow men to compete against women. And so the recent blatant injustice that occurred in Samoa at the 16th Pacific Games in the women's weightlifting competition sets a precedence that it will discourage women from participating in elite sport. We talk a lot about empowering women, and this is not how you do it. The winner of the women's 87 kilogram division was Hubbard. Now, he's a man identifying as a woman. Stowers was the competitor who came second. She was denied the gold medal by lifting 7 kilo less than Hubbard. Now, Hubbard is technically a man, and ironically, when he was asked about competing against women, he responded, he said this, "I think you have to be true to yourself." He has previously, he's been in weightlifting for his entire career. He previously represented New Zealand in weightlifting as a man, and this time he represented New Zealand as a transgendered woman, competing against women. And this is the truth, ladies and gentlemen. Hubbard does not belong in the women's competition. There's a madness taking over the minds of so-called progressives, and I want to just briefly give you one other example. There's a case right now at the moment that's going through the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Maria De Silva is a beautician. She works from home. She does so because she has young children. And a man identifying as a woman contacted her and asked for an appointment to have his genitals waxed. Maria said that she didn't provide that service, and because of this, Maria has been referred to the Human Rights Tribunal. Now, there are many good reasons, without going into gory details, why a woman would not wish to provide a service which requires her to touch a strange, naked man's private parts in her own home with her children present. And yet this is precisely the sort of nonsense that is being supported by progressive politicians. It's been enabled by our media, it's being shoved down our throats, and we are under threat all the time of being taken before tribunals and punished if we don't toe the line. In this age we are living in, there is a denial of the existence of objective truth, but this is not an option for the child of God. Jesus said, "I am the truth." And he is where our answers are found. And his word tells us that God created man and woman. And this truth is actually backed up by science. There are two sexes, XX and XY. Anything outside of that is a genetic abnormality that can still be classified as male or female based on the presence or absence of the Y chromosome. There is no Z and there is no W, except if it stands for Wendy. Cosmetic surgery and cross-sex hormones cannot change us into the opposite sex. They can affect appearances, they can actually stunt or even damage some of our outward expressions of our reproductive organs, but they cannot turn someone from one sex into the other. As Princeton philosopher Robert P. George put it like this, he said, "Changing sexes is a metaphysical impossibility because it is a biological impossibility." Sex is not a spectrum. Sex change is physically impossible. Transgendered men do not become women, nor do transgendered women become men. All of them become feminised men or masculinised women, and they are counterfeits or impersonators of the sex that they want to identify as. And to assert anything else is actually a cruel lie, because it will never provide the long-term wholeness and happiness that people actually seek. If we love our children, if we seek the kingdom of God and his glory, we must continue to fight for truth to be freely spoken in our classrooms and in our public spaces. And this is what the Australian Christian Lobby seeks to do. We are called to shine like stars in the universe as we hold out the word of life. And as we do this, it will not be possible to escape conflict, because when we identify with Jesus, we're actually part of a war. But we didn't start the war. It was God who actually declared war on Satan. But we are in a war. And what is really important is that if we suffer, make sure that you're suffering for Jesus' sake and for righteousness' sake, and not because we ourselves are being difficult or proud, because we hold the truth. There is a big difference between the offence of the cross and offensive Christians. There are many compelling ways that we can speak truth, kindly, lovingly and concernedly. So many Australians are waiting for sensible voices in this space of gender fluidity. I have actually written 2 very simple children's books that are available today. They don't go into any gory details for children, but they are just simply affirming their malehood or their female. But as I close, I just want to thank you for being here, first of all, actually, because just your support for being here is so encouraging. Thank you. But let me encourage you also to join us as we commit to speaking truth in public, and as we speak that truth, we want to speak that truth in love. Thank you very much.